We're here to talk about the high stakes of getting blockchain right on the national security stage, which has so many different implications and vectors, whether we're talking about countering illicit finance, fostering geostrategic competition. All of these are going to be the key issues that we're going to dive into today. So first, we're going to start off with an intro for this incredible panel and give a little bit of a background about what role that we've played in national security, but also in regards to how blockchain and national security have touched what we've been doing. So I'll kick it off. So I'm Carole House. I'm, like he mentioned, I'm an executive in residence at TerraNet Ventures. But I also was at the White House driving a lot of work in the National Security Council focused on digital assets, as well as ransomware. As well as countering ransomware across the US government and driving the counter-ransomware campaign and trying to fight that despicable crime. In addition to that, I was at FinCEN, the US anti-money laundering regulator, and the lead to the FinCEN delegation to the FATF, creating the first international standards for crypto. So that helps to highlight a lot of the national security nexus related to blockchain and crypto that I've been a part of. But I'll turn it over first, Sanjay, if you can introduce yourself and talk about the role that you've played in national security with blockchain as well.
No, sure. Thanks, Carole. And again, welcome to all of you. My name is Sanjay Gupta, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of Auradine. Auradine is a high-technology company based in Silicon Valley. We design really specialized semiconductor chips. We develop the full systems around that and the full software stack for Bitcoin mining. Yeah. We're also involved in other blockchains. So we're looking at a variety of them. But we're based in the US, we design in the US, and we think it's critical to have technology of this type, which is based in the US. Given the importance of Bitcoin to the US energy ecosystem, the overall economic ecosystem, and just overall technological advancement. So we think it's a very critical role in terms of alignment with US policy around technology. So again, very excited to be there. I've been in the industry for a little over 30 years. I used to be in management consulting. I was a partner at McKinsey. And then I was in financial services and fintech for a long time before migrating to this area. So thanks, Carole.
Great. And then Congressman Nunn.
Well, Carole, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody being out here today, both those here live with us as well as those watching. This is a great opportunity to really talk about one of the emerging threats that we're seeing, not just for the United States, but it's going to revolutionize where we are, both in the Internet of Things space, but particularly when we talk about blockchain and what its compounding impact means for major corporations to all of us as individual citizens. I'm in my first year being a member of Congress, and I've been 20 years in the military. I thought military deployments were wild. Being in Washington, D.C. in this role has been very much a learning opportunity. After a couple of decades serving both as an intelligence officer on airborne reconnaissance, as well as at the National Security Agency as a cyber operations officer, switched over to the intelligence community, got to work with some incredible people like Morgan here, really working as the first national counterintelligence officer at ODNI for cyber, and what that NCIO position should be. We morphed into our time together working on the National Security Council and identifying some of the great success stories that were coming out of the private sector that led us into the opportunity where government was really learning from what was happening around the world. And I will say I was one of those guys mining Bitcoin while I was at NSA on my home computer. Don't worry, they're all ended up in a dumpster at some point. That's what I'll tell myself when we lost out. A huge aspect of this now is what can we be doing in the policy space to really drive success here? And as a guy who is serving on the House Financial Services Committee, working on the National Defense Subcommittee, and then doing a lot of what we're trying to drive in the public sector to be able to better align with what's happening in the private sector, we're trying to take best practices from both to be able to lead forward. I also serve on the China Commission, and we're looking directly at who's our near-peer partner or potential adversary in this space. And China certainly is going to be a topic we're going to discuss a lot today. And I think it bears noting here that China has the potential to really drive a game-changing element in this. And that we in the United States and the Five Eyes allies really need to prioritize this as an area where we've got to be a leading partner in this, so we don't have some of the experiences that have happened historically that put us at a strategic disadvantage. So with that, I want to tee up the woman of the hour who's just arrived, Miss Morgan. Thank you so much for all you do. Glad to have you as the hostess.
Thank you so much. We've got 23 minutes left of exciting, a fascinating conversation. I'm sure, it's very timely that you bring up China. I was just with the former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, right before this on the Morgan Ortagus show. We were filming an interview. You can watch online or listen on SiriusXM. But I want to hear from all three of you, your take. There's so much that's going to be discussed today on this topic, but specifically on this panel, we're here to talk about the national security implications that are related to blockchain, to cryptocurrencies. And I think that that's not a topic that's discussed enough in the United States, especially we spend so much time discussing the economic side of things. But if you could break down, and everybody give, again, 30, 60 seconds, your take on why this is actually a national security issue. And we'll start with Carole.
Great. Well, I know it's something that that I know we all have a very common thread on, was that we were a part of the cyber and tech discussions in the age of Huawei, and the bans that we put in place, not only on the executive branch side but also the legislative side, and working with international partners, and in many cases after you had already extremely expensive implementations that then needed to be ripped and replaced. It underscored the consequences of not thinking about the fact of what was the future of infrastructure going to be. And that is, of course, part of the value proposition presented by people in the blockchain space. This is a technology. We all know this. It's not inherently financial or not. It is a database technology, and it's something that is envisioned by many to be a part of the future of what Web3 infrastructure looks like. So the potential consequences of infrastructure that has poor cybersecurity built in and potential points for compromise, and looking for what the right kinds of resilience measures are, what governance and accountability looks like in the future of infrastructure, I think is really front and center. And with China, given the massive amount of innovation that we're seeing in China through partnerships that they're building, like the Blockchain Services Network and integration into their Digital Belt and Road Initiative, it's something where we're seeing state-level engagement and interest in trying to drive investment in this infrastructure that's Chinese-based, and we've already seen where those consequences exist for espionage and surveillance. So I think that the U.S. needs to be pointed at that kind of national security concern, and hopefully trying to help us get right now before those expensive rip and replace regimes happen, so that 10 years from now we're not worried because all smart cities are being built on Chinese blockchain infrastructure.
Well, and we are going to get to everybody, but I just want to follow up what you said there, because I think it's really important. We have people that are incredibly sophisticated investors here, but we also probably have people tuning in on the live stream that are trying to understand the national security implications for the first time. And so if I heard you correctly, I believe what you're saying is the concern is our national infrastructure, our power grids, our energy infrastructure, that could be compromised by the Chinese Communist Party.
It potentially could, certainly not only the fact that there's certainly state actors and cyber threats more generally, but then if the infrastructure, if infrastructure was adopted and built into U.S. infrastructure at scale on systems that we know to be compromised, then that could end up presenting a massive national security threat to us. That's why we put in place bans on things like Huawei technology in our infrastructure. I recognize that the same potential for that kind of compromise can exist in the blockchain space. I'm not saying that there's massive implementations happening now, but actually I'm sure Congressman Nunn will speak about, I think, the vision that he sees with some legislation that he's introduced related to trying to prevent this potential threat and mitigate the risk now to prevent that kind of compromise in the future.
So Sanjay, following up on that, how do you see blockchain as a national security issue for all Americans?
No, sure. So I'll just build on what actually Carole was just talking about. So first of all, area blockchain, one of the big appeals is that it's decentralized. That's really the nature. On the supply side, interestingly today, most of the supply is heavily concentrated among a few manufacturers or suppliers in China. And we know, that there's a potential of influence from the Chinese government. I think that has three risks from a national security point of view for the US. The first is the one that Carole talked about, is that this equipment is connected to the US energy ecosystem in a very significant way. A number of these equipment are also close to sensitive installations. So we just, in fact, day before yesterday, there was, I think, a first CFIUS action, which took place, which actually recognized a concern of these Chinese equipment being close to sensitive installations and being connected to the energy ecosystem. So that's one, risk number one. Risk number two is that this technology requires the latest semiconductor technology. So semiconductors, you actually talk about in terms of transistors. And I don't want to get too technical out here, but it's measured in terms of distance and the size of transistors. And this technology is now getting down to what is called 5, 4, and 3 nanometer technology, which is the same technology that's used in AI and in other sensitive defense installations. The US government has been, rightfully so, trying to ensure that that supremacy remains in the US, and Chinese companies do not get access to the technology directly or indirectly. So Chinese companies are getting access to this technology through the blockchain technology area with potential uses in areas outside of that. Because there's the same technology that Apple uses in its latest iPhones or NVIDIA uses in its latest AI technology. Right? So that's concern number 2. And then concern number 3 is that Bitcoin, for instance, has become a part of the financial ecosystem. There's a number of ETFs. I know a number of them are speaking over the course of the day-to-day. A large number of Americans own Bitcoin. I think over 90 million. It's getting to around 40% of adults, if not higher, as we speak. And you want the overall Bitcoin chain to be decentralized. At the same time, if you have supply concentrated, there's a risk of a 51% attack by any one group or state entity in the case of extreme circumstances. So I think that's risk number 3 that I think is of key concern, and it's often not that fully understood. So I'm really glad, Senator, with the work that you've been doing, and Carole, the work that you and others are doing in this space, to highlight that and showcase it.
Well, the 3 of you are blockchain experts. I'm a national security person. Congressman, so good to see you again. I'm thrilled to have you in the Congress, and what a year you've had. I don't know if you would have run if you would have known what you've been dealing with. But I like to try to break things down simplistically so everybody can understand. And when I think about TikTok, for example, it strikes me as odd that there's the version of TikTok in the United States would never be allowed for the children, the young people of China. It also strikes me as odd that the cryptocurrencies, the infrastructure that the Chinese Communist Party owns here in the United States, it's not even allowed in China. So again, I'm a simple lady, I'm in the military, I'm not focusing as much on crypto and blockchain as you are. So help me make that make sense. Why is it okay for the Chinese to do these sorts of TikTok and cryptocurrencies here in the United States, but it's not good for them at home?
Morgan, I think you nailed it on the head. Look, the next major conflict in the world is going to be in the battle space where whoever owns the digital information is going to have the strategic high ground on this. She, who is a writer from the Ming Dynasty, in 36 Stratagems writes the story of kill with a borrowed knife. And it's a Chinese philosophy of if you can't fight the direct conflict, find a way to get in on elements that your adversary can't. And so while we would never allow TikTok to be operated inside China under the PRC's regime, or a number of these elements to exist, they do want to find a way to get into the US or the Western markets. And what is truly frightening here is, as Carole highlighted with Huawei, this is a way to kill with a borrowed knife, to be able to get our data they won't be able to do through good legislation that we're leading right now to prevent the buying of farmland in America. I'm leading legislation to close down shell companies of Chinese operations operating nefariously on US soil. But with blockchain, they have the ability to get that digital information that is going to really define what the next chapter between the US and China look like. And by capturing that strategic high ground, they're going to have the ability to really influence both what the United States and the West to operate with and how we access that information. Making sure that we have a good blocking and tackling mechanism now is something that's going to pay dividends not just in the decade ahead, but in the months ahead. It's one of the reasons that we have led so strongly working with this team on a bill called the Clarity Act. In fact, one of our team here who helped draft this together really highlights through Andrew, the importance of making sure that we are laying out good rules of the road for anyone onboarding on the US government, new blockchain technologies, that it's vetted with Treasury, with Commerce, with the intelligence communities early in this process, so we don't have, this Trojan horse of a new Chinese exfil route for our most critical data, or worse, that we end up operating on the backbone of a Chinese-based blockchain that really has the ability to control, manipulate, deploy, or retract information that's essential for the U.S. critical infrastructure, commercial sector, and private sector, not least to mention our defense sector going forward.
I was going to ask you about the Clarity Act, so thank you for bringing that up. But let me follow up on that, because I think that you have been critical of other proposed legislation from Senator Warren and others, the Digital Asset Anti-Money Laundering Act, which may inadvertently actually hinder innovation and sort of could make us dependent on that Chinese blockchain that you just referred to. So can you explain, again, why you are not supportive of her legislation?
Yeah, Morgan, I think you bring up a really good point here. When it comes to digital assets, we have in the U.S. tried to do nothing in this space and then roll in heavy. And the U.S. government is want to have all the best ideas. Rarely, though, do they take the time to talk to experts in the field. And so when you look at what Gary Gensler is doing at the Securities and Exchange Commission to try and make every digital asset that exists look like a security, that just doesn't fit. The CFTC, I mean, I'm a guy from Iowa. We understand what a commodities market and pork bellies look like. A lot of the innovation that's coming up in this has the ability to be a very successful digital asset, but they've got to have, the space to be able to take off without government regulation crushing it before it even has the opportunity to launch. Even the CFTC has been, nebulous on this and then weighs in at the last moment trying to change the rules of the road. And certainly what Elizabeth Warren has offered is that it's easier to just kill a lot of these digital assets at the beginning and have just the top ones emerge that, in my opinion, she aims to just regulate to death. The result is already stunning. We have seen so many digital assets decide that they can't operate in the United States and so leave for the Bahamas. Or worse, go to Russia, China, Iran, in an area where at least they can, have a market that's successful. What I don't want to see is a lessening of the U.S. dollar to a digital asset that can only find home in a totalitarian regime, which also has the ability not only to track its own population with this, but potentially to manipulate markets over the world. So let's find a great place where we have a left and right boundary. We need to have some standardization for digital asset, but we also have to have a great expressway where innovation can take off and grow. America's one of the best growers of this, but if we decide to put up a roadblock, every 15 feet, digital assets will find another market where they can operate.
Carole, you look like you were, you both want to jump in on that. Okay, go ahead, Sanjay, and then Carole.
No, sure. So I just wanted to build on that, because I think, Congressman, you laid it out, that I think that blockchain and digital assets are a critical part for the U.S. on a number of dimensions. So a lot of people are not even aware the role that, for instance, even Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining plays in the energy ecosystem to balance the grid in a number of places. It also spurs investment in renewable energy, in projects that otherwise would not have got funded. At the same time, it's also part of the now economic ecosystem. When you talk about decentralized assets, the amount of ownership, the ETS, the money that's flowing into that, it's a critical part of the US ecosystem. And then from an innovation and technology point of view, it's critical. This is forefront of the latest generation of technology that the US would lag behind. So on a number of dimensions, as I think, Congressman, you're mentioning, it's critical. There needs to be the appropriate boundaries and guardrails, but it cannot be that this is bad. It's that this is critical. And at the same time, it needs to have the right, of course, the rules of the road, the right appropriate regulation around it. So it needs to have their appropriate balanced approach, is what I think. You're also just building on what you're saying.
Yeah.
I wanted to, reinforce and foot stomp the balance thing. And I know part of this will be me defending the Biden administration specifically, because I know that I hear the criticism from industry often saying that the Biden administration hates crypto, and in my view, which recognize that I was at the National Security Council helping to drive this, so it's not a surprising view that I feel that it was balanced. The standing guidance from the president has been a balance to mitigate the risks, but also to promote the positive, responsible innovation. The Department of Commerce, at the direction of the president, developed and issued a competitiveness framework which talks about the need for effective regulatory frameworks, which points at the need for also thriving markets that are compliant and have the right rules of the road. And I do hope personally that understanding that where there's opportunities for us to clarify, on-ramps into supervision and into registration, I think are good opportunities. I also think that the U.S. has the longest in place regulatory framework, especially on countering illicit finance, of any nation in the world. And I know FinCEN spoke earlier, but it is highly respected globally and for good reason. So part of the balance that we need in the U.S. is also focusing on those international partners who need to step up and implement appropriately what the FATF standards are. Most countries have have not still taken meaningful steps to put in place compliance standards. Enforcement actions in the US even take like half a decade up to a decade to put in place. And honestly, for responsible actors in the space, that's a long time for responsible actors to be acting compliantly and with greater costs than those who are not. So ultimately, part of that balance is us like bringing enforcement. I like it early and often. Again, not surprising from a former regulator, but because if you do it early and often, then you're shaping. You're not breaking a sector. You're helping to like point a sector and give it a North Star in a direction. And you're also rewarding the good actors in the space by helping to redirect and impose those consequences on the more illicitly acting individuals and entities. So I feel part of that balance I do think is reflected in the administration's position. I understand and take to heart, especially a few independent regulators and some of their positions on things. And so, but I'm heartened to believe that I think that we've got some good momentum to move forward. But competitiveness in this tech, where crypto is both a symptom and a driver of some of the concerns that Congressman Nunn and you also mentioned about the U.S. dollar and dominance, are really critical and foremost in mind for national security folks.
You know, Sanjay, as we continue on this national security discussion as it relates to blockchain, I'm wondering if you can explain to everybody the aspect of the Bitcoin hardware market and the way in which it's dominated by Chinese firms and why that is a national security risk.
No, sure. So thanks, Morgan, for that. So in terms of Bitcoin, I think a lot of the audience may already be aware, but in case somebody is not, it actually requires that every transaction that is conducted on the chain has to be validated. And that process of validation requires a certain amount of compute. So it's almost like solving a mathematical puzzle, a complicated mathematical puzzle. And every 10 minutes, there's a new block of transactions that are put onto the Bitcoin chain. Now, that equipment requires technology which drives it. So think about it like a mini but a supercomputer, right? That's driving that technology. That technology is the one that's powered by this latest chips and innovation around it. Today, nearly 100% of that technology comes from just 2 or 3 Chinese companies. So nearly 100% of the supply is dominated by China, which is just really, in fact, just a risk in itself, just given the decentralized nature, otherwise, of the protocol on the usage side of it. And that's where I said that even just for the chain itself, there's a risk if you have 1 or 2 or 3 major actors, all of them Chinese-based. If they wanted to take over the network, they could potentially orchestrate an attack on that. So that itself, in its own right, is a big risk. And given the amount of finances involved, the amount of money involved in ETFs in the US, the amount of ownership of, for instance, Bitcoin among individuals across the US, that itself is a risk. Besides the other risks around access to technology that it provides and the sensitive installations that Carole and Congressman have been talking about.
Congressman, we've talked about Huawei, we've talked about TikTok, we've talked about mining operations and the hardware. If you look at it from a 50,000-foot level, I think the heart of the matter that Congress and regulators are trying to deal with is foreign ownership, especially adversarial foreign ownership of critical infrastructure in the United States. So how do you tackle that overarching problem?
Yeah, I think Carole and I both were at the NSC and working on this when we saw Huawei try and bid on the London Olympics and build out an entire infrastructure literally overnight for the UK. MI5 and MI6 were good enough to be able to walk back from that because we saw a blip one day where the connective tissue for the infrastructure all went through Beijing. All the data reviewed, analyzed, potentially captured by the Chinese government. That was not an accident, that was by design. What we're seeing now, particularly with blockchain, is the same type of model being played out in a way where President Xi himself has said, this is a strategic opportunity we have to seize now. Building the roadway for this is going to be the underpinning of the future of artificial intelligence for the world. It also means that the Chinese are actively looking for those critical resources, as they've done in every other sector. So to be able to compete with this, I think we need a holistic approach of the folks who want to come on board and really serve this to keep it that federated style where innovation gets to flourish, where government defines not only clear lanes in the road, but protects this as a national security risk if we don't provide some real guidance early on. And we start this, Morgan, by really looking at what we're doing as the U.S. government, as one of the biggest procurers of this infrastructure, particularly within the Department of Defense as well as Commerce, to be able to drive this in a way that not only helps safeguard Americans, but American industry and the opportunities going forward. And I absolutely agree with Carole on this. There's a great opportunity for both government and private sector not only to learn from each other, but from our partner nations to be an implementer of the success of this going forward. What we're seeing out of the Five Eyes, out of Europe as well, but some really sophisticated innovators in Asia as well. And I highlight Singapore and Japan as being a lead charger and a counterbalance to what China is trying to establish for its own digital Belt and Road Initiative.
If I can,
Close us out, Carole. Yeah.
Yes,
please.
I love everything that you just said. Of course, Congressman. I'm very concerned about the issue of the efficiencies of digitization being able to be exploited well by the efficiencies of autocracies, especially ones like China that can divert and focus a state's worth of resources towards this space. And where I do think your marker about the fact that we need to drive U.S. competitiveness in this, because what makes us special generally is our money in tech, which is based and fostered by our rule of law and human rights and our democratic principles being built in. We need to figure out how to harness and point the sector in that responsible innovation direction, because the sector is our answer to competition there, because we don't want to have those Chinese rails underlying our critical infrastructure. So thank you. I love those comments. Thank you, Congressman.
And what about, Carole, what about the cybersecurity aspect of all of this? What should cyber experts be doing?
Well, a lot. I will say that since
you have a minute 40.
Great. Others can too. But since we have state actors like Lazarus Group, like North Korea's major cybercrime operations, shifting from targeting banks and SWIFT hacks and going to DeFi. For a reason, because it's a lot easier to target and compromise and then to launder $500 million per hack. That is a problem. It's a problem for the sector. It's basically the consequences when you launch open source software that is also a money transmission. It's a high risk, high value sector. We need to put in place the relevant controls, including cybersecurity for this. So I think there's a great market for more cyber experts. There's not a lot of people at the nexus of cyber and blockchain expertise. So we certainly need more of that being built in. And I'm encouraged by some standards efforts that are being driven on that, including by some of the people in this room.
Well, I'm sure we have some innovators and some young people in this room that could be at the nexus that you just talked about. Congressman, I'm curious, do you think in the presidential debates this year, listen, we can't get away from it, we're in a campaign season. Do you think that that blockchain, cryptos writ large, will be something that's talked about from a policy perspective on the debate stage?
Look, I'm from Iowa. We get all the presidential contenders out there. Morgan, anytime you want to come back, we will frame this well for you. I don't know that we'll have the conversation in depth that we need to on blockchain, but we need to talk about what national security looks like in the digital space. First and foremost, what effective deterrence looks like, both in the public and the private sector, to be able to frame our adversaries on this. And that includes everything from insurance, going after ransomware, to really establishing what a U.S. national strategy in cybersecurity looks like. I hope both contenders really look at this seriously. It'll be a deciding factor for a lot of Americans.
Sanjay, you get the final word, my friend.
No, thanks a lot. But again, first of all, terrific discussion out here. Thanks a lot, Congressman. Thanks a lot, Carole, and of course, Morgan. On this, I just say that there's a lot of awareness and discussion on topics when it comes to telecom. The Huawei example. Or when it comes to AI, more recently, people get it. In the case of blockchain, I think just the one thing which I've observed is that there's not been as much awareness and discussion in a variety of policy forums. So I just think having that awareness on the criticality of the sector to the US economy and the risk that it portrays from a national security point of view is important. So just having that awareness, we have some really good, both policymakers, enforcers, but just having that awareness of what blockchain is and what the national security risks are, I think will make a huge difference in space.
Well, I need to have all three of you on the Morgan Ortagus show on Sirius XM pretty soon to talk about this, don't you think? Thank you, guys. You're an amazing panel. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.